Hey, it's Jag. In part 3 of our series on stereo guitar rigs, we're going to talk about pros and cons of going stereo. So as I was editing all of this, I realized we were going to end up with 4 videos. Originally I thought this was going to be 1 half-hour video. Then I realized it was going to be at least 3, and now editing what I thought was going to be the final segment, it's just too long, so I'm breaking that down to 2. So this will be a 4 video series. This one I will discuss pros and cons of going stereo in a live situation in studio recording and in your home rehearsal setup. The next video I will go through some of the demos I recorded previously, and we'll run them through various different scenarios where they may or may not sound as good as you think. So that will be in the next video. The other thing, I did get a new camera to shoot with, and so you may notice that this video looks a little bit different. I'm still learning how the camera works, but I'm using that new camera. I'm not going to say what it is just yet. I want to do a video on that later. But one thing you can see clearly, I'm looking at myself in the monitor here, I probably should have shaved. We've gone through all of this, playing around with setting up various stereo guitar rigs, old school and modern, using a twin tracker, and all those methods sound really great, but it's under the right conditions. So you need to also consider pros and cons to running a stereo rig. And some of the things that don't occur to guitar players can really catch you live. Like I said, originally this was going to be why you shouldn't run a stereo rig, and that was actually sparked by some conversations that were going on, again, on one of the Two Notes Facebook groups. Some of the guys were talking about how they were using their Captor X, and they had everything sounding so awesome in their headphones at home when they were practicing, and then they went out to a gig and it sounded small or thin or tinny, didn't sound right. And that's not the fault of Two Notes or the guy mixing the band or anything. It has to do with the things that, as a guitar player, you may not be aware of or may not have considered. I've written a list of pros and cons for the 3 general situations a musician will find themselves in, which is live, studio, and then home recording. So first off, live, and this is where you really want to be careful about making your decision to go stereo or not, and really checking out how that's going to translate in several scenarios. When you're at home in your studio, your home studio, and you're playing everything stereo, everything sounds great. You've set it up that way. It's where you practice. You have control over everything. And of course, you've dialed it so it sounds good, but you cannot assume that this is going to translate live. You have a lot of other factors to deal with, maybe different equipment, oftentimes, most of the time, a house PA system and a house engineer. Those can be the problem as well. I don't bemoan anybody going out and mixing a band at a live venue because they enjoy doing it, and many of these people that do it are really doing it for the love of it, and they do have the best interest of the band at heart. Some people, if they're not necessarily professionals, that's not a bad or good thing one way or the other, but they may not have the experience to know some of these issues as well. So let's go through my list. So the first couple of cons, many clubs or small venues and even some theaters, they don't run their systems in stereo. So you might see a set of speakers on each side or an array of speakers on each side, say in a small theater. Does not mean that that system is stereo. So you may come into a situation where you've got your great sounding stereo rig, but it's not going out a stereo system, so that's going to get lost. And there can be some negative effects of that, taking that stereo signal and forcing it down into a mono signal. The other con is that even if the house system is stereo, the house engineer may not be mixing you stereo. The house engineer, especially if he doesn't work with you regularly and doesn't know your material, is going to treat you like any other band. He's going to have a setup. He'll have the drums. He probably has, the drums panned, because a drum kit is a fairly known quantity. He'll have the kick in the middle, for example, and the snare in the middle. He'll have some stereo overheads panned left and right, and he might have the hi-hat, panned over to one side, and the toms on this side panned. That's a pretty obvious no-brainer kind of situation. When it comes to the rest of the band, though, the bass will be up the center. Maybe if you're the only guitar player, you'll be panned up the center, or if you have a keyboard player or another guitar player, he may pan you guys a little bit to the left or right, but essentially you will still be coming out in mono. You won't have this stereo spread, because he'll have one mic in front of your cabinets. A good house engineer, especially who does sound for bands in that situation where he's not traveling with the band, his main concern is going to be making the vocalist sound as good as he possibly can, and that's what he should do. It's what most people identify with. Sure, all your friends are guitar players, you're a guitar player. When you go see a band, all you care about is how good the guitar sounds. That's because you're a guitar player. The average person listening is hearing the vocalist. And the job of the house engineer, again, especially if he doesn't know the band, is to make that vocalist sound as good as possible, or the vocalists. So he may have a stereo setup, and he may be running stereo reverbs, delays, that kind of thing, but he's going to apply that more to the vocalist. And I'm not saying anything bad about house engineers. Like I say, they don't know you, so they know a job, and they do it very well. A pro to going stereo, if you're traveling with your own sound system and your own front of house engineer, or your rider specifies a stereo front of house system, and everybody is understanding the intricacies of your band, whether that's a house provided engineer where you send him information on your mix and how to mix and what mics you need and what should be put where, or again, like I say, he's a guy who travels with you. Great. Stereo front of house system, a front of house guy who knows your material and knows how you have set it up, then that's awesome. Go stereo live in that situation. There are cons, though, as well to that. You might have a stereo system. You've got everything mic'd up. You've got two mics on your two amps, and so you've got your lush stereo sound on stage. But the front of house guy didn't do his homework, and he doesn't work with you and doesn't know you. He might say, yes, we've got two mics on there, so you're in stereo, but he may not have even panned those two mics left and right. He might have them coming right up the center. So again, you've got your nice lush stereo sound on stage, but what's coming out front is a mono guitar signal. Essentially, your effects are still there, but it's not in stereo. That can cause some other problems to your tone. The other con that I think a lot of musicians don't pay attention to is, even if the front of house is stereo and you've got your stereo rig on stage, your monitor mix is likely to be mono. Again, unless it's your own, and it might be a wedge in front of you, or in which case at least you'll still hear your rig behind you in stereo, and you'll know it's coming out the front in stereo. But if you are all working with in-ears and your stage volume is low enough, your in-ears are not going to give you that stereo signal, so you won't benefit from that lush stereo signal. Some people that's not a problem for. They're just playing guitar and they can accommodate it whatever way it sounds. Other players are really affected by that. If it's not what they expect, it's really distracting. So these are the main pros and cons of going live. Mainly if you can't ensure that your front of house is going to be in stereo, and that your front of house engineer is going to mix you in stereo, you're probably better served to at least have a setup that you can run mono and still get 90% of the way to where the sound is what you would like, keeping in mind that you don't have a stereo sound field to deal with necessarily. Again, if you know the front of house is stereo and the guy mixing it is going to accommodate you that way, then go for it. Studio. There are, in my opinion, you just don't record stereo. Double track your guitars, or the effects will be put on in post. There are some pros and some times when you would record stereo, but general rule of thumb, I wouldn't get too hung up about being stereo in the studio. That's going to be accomplished in a different way. But some of the pros, you most likely aren't going to be tracking a mono project in this day and age. So the producer and engineer are probably thinking stereo anyway. So no problem there. The other pros is if you're using those stereo effects as effects, stereo ping pong delays. I used the example earlier of Brian May, Brighton Rock, or, those kinds of things, or dotted eighth note delays, playing off each other left and right, where it's a really obvious effect, or the edge from U2. You'd want to record those things and commit them in stereo generally. Another pro, which can also be a negative, is if the stereo sound you've set up, you're sure that's how you want your final mix of your guitar to sound, then yeah, go ahead, commit it. Have it recorded to 2-3 tracks. I would strongly suggest record one dry track so you can change it later if you decide you don't like it. But if you're very confident that the sound you have, the stereo setup you've mixed, is the way you want your final guitar to sound, then go ahead and record that. What are some of the cons to going stereo in the studio? If you are not the engineer or not the producer, or you're called in as a session guy, I think it would be the kiss of death as a session guy to go in and insist that you run stereo. That's not your job in that situation. That's the job of the producer. Same thing even if it's your band. You hire a producer to do what he thinks is best, to represent your music best. So, at the end of the day, you have to get the producer and the engineer to agree to your sound, your stereo sound signal. The engineer might not agree that your stereo sound is what he wants to commit. In that case, talk to the producer. The producer is the guy who has the final say. So you go talk to the producer. If the producer doesn't agree with you, basically, too bad. The producer's the boss. Even if it's your band, the producer's been hired for that, and to make those decisions, and you agree to give him that kind of control, unless you're self-produced. So those are a couple of cons. The other con, another con, like I say, once you've committed that stereo sound to tape, there's very little you can do to change it after the fact if you decide you don't like what you've done, except maybe add more effects which might smear it or make it sound even worse. And it is a general rule of thumb never to commit things like reverb, delay, even to some degree modulation at the time of recording. Many of those things will be added in post. Yes, you'll add your wah, you'll add your overdrives, your whammy effects, those kinds of things. Yeah, you'll definitely commit with those because they are integral to the sound that you're recording. But things like delay, reverb, and like I say, you kind of be fence-ish with modulation, but those things will generally be applied in post. Of course, you know, if you're a Robin Trower fan, you listen to Bridge of Sighs, that rotovibe was committed, but it again was an integral part of the sound of that song. They didn't wonder what they were going to do with it. That was how they wanted it to sound when they recorded. Also, it was recorded, 50 years ago. Probably was the only way they could have got that sound to tape. So that's some of the studio things. Another con, and this is one we'll talk about in some of the demonstrations. The signal can be affected by the potential effects of your tracks being summed to mono. So you're recording this in stereo and you're going to assume everybody's going to listen to it in stereo, but that's not always the case. Radio stations playing your music, they may not be broadcasting in stereo. Some phones, older, I don't know if they're all stereo now, but older phones, the iPhones, older versions of the iPhones were mono, at least through the built-in speaker. You could plug headphones in and you would get a stereo experience, but if you were just listening to it on your phone, that's going to be a mono signal. I don't know if it's summed to mono or if it's just playing left or right side, but those are negative things that can impact your people who are listening to your recording. You don't know how they're going to be listening to that music, and that can have a negative effect. Same thing in public venues. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a restaurant and they're playing music and it drives me nuts to hear a song that I know and only hear the left or right side, either because the speaker is right here and the other one is on the other side of the restaurant, or sometimes these people are just running one side of the stereo to the whole restaurant. Listen to some of your favorite music and only listen on one headphone and you'll find out what's missing. And that drives me bananas. And again, you want to make sure you have a sound that is at least going to represent in that situation. If you are running, say, a wet-dry signal and you've got a third of a second delay, and that happens to be the side that the people are hearing, your guitar is going to sound completely out of sync with the rest of the band. On the other side of that, if you're doing the ping pong delay and it's part of the sound or the effect you want, and again, only one side of this stereo is being played, and they're playing the side that has your dry signal, your ping pongs might not be there, so it won't sound as you intended. So these are some things to consider. And yes, we have no control over some of these things, and some of these things we can just say, well, we don't care about. But you should at least be aware those are possibilities. In home practice, go for it. Do whatever you want. You're the only one you're trying to impress. So, you got your phones on or your stereo desktop speakers, and you've got your interface in front of you, and you've got this, you're just having fun playing with all this stereo stuff. Go for it. The only real con is if you get something you really, really like, and it's heavily stereo, and you want to take that live, then you're subject to all the things that we've talked about before. I don't want to sound negative on stereo rigs, I'm not, but you do need to consider what might happen. So that kind of brings me to what I would call the how bad could it be? I'm going stereo anyway. Well, there you go. That's sort of my take on whether we'd want to run stereo or not, and situations in which it may or may not be a good idea to run stereo. If you found this informative or entertaining, please smash that like button. That helps out a lot. And like and subscribe. Over the winter, I've got some good projects coming up. As always, check out my band One Soul Thrust. The links are below. Thanks for watching.